So you want to learn how to do Zercher deadlifts? Well, here's a complete guide with some tips on how to get you there.
In this video, I'm going to go over stuff like foot position, grip, hip height, how to bail, and then also give some tips on how to build up to them and a quick talk on programming them. Starting off with stance width, for a full Zercher deadlift, you're going to have a slightly wider stance because you have to grip the bar in between your legs. Some people would prefer a stance that's just outside their arms, which is more like a frog stance, and I know the Art of Ego Lifting pulls this way, and he's pulled some huge numbers with this stance. Other people might prefer a wider stance more similar to a sumo. However, I find that if you go into the extreme ranges like a full sumo stance, it just sucks for Zercher deadlift. And I myself started out with a frog stance, but over time I've slowly shifted my feet out to more mimic my sumo stance. They're just slightly narrower than it, but my sumo stance is still within the rings on a powerlifting bar. I've done that because I find that I'm just slightly more comfortable and stronger with a wider stance, but one stance isn't necessarily better than the other. There's been big pulls with both stances. So find whatever's most comfortable for you at first, just so you can get into the lift, and then you can worry about exploring other stances after that. Moving on to grip, there's two main overarching kind of groups of grip with some subsets in them. So the two main groups are either hands apart or hands together. For hands apart, the two kind of main subsets of that are palms up or palms facing each other. You can have your hands open, your fingers splayed, your hands closed like in fists. It doesn't really matter because the bar is at your elbow joint. And there have been some big lifts with the hands apart lifts. For example, Eric Bugenhagen used to have a arms apart kind of grip, but he would touch tips in the middle a bit. So it's kind of like a pseudo hands apart grip, but I'll still count it. Also, my good buddy Alex Sterner uses a hands apart grip, and he does some jujitsu. So I think there's some transfer over to a sport with a hands apart grip, but we can get into the nuances of that another time. And then for the hands together, the two subsets of that are the same as with the hands apart. So you can either have your palms facing each other or your palms together. For the palms facing each other, it's usually easiest to interlock your fingers like you're praying to the god of gain so that you can lift that weight up. And for the palms facing up, you're just going to place one hand on top of the other, and then you can squeeze that top hand with your bottom hand. Again, you can kind of have open hands for this, closed fist hands. I use the palms together and facing up grip. I find that just making a fist with my top hand and then squeezing it with my bottom hand gives me the best grip on it. Although I'm not really thinking about that too much, just kind of doing it. And over the years, Rick Della Stick has moved from touch and tips to doing the palms together and palms up grip. So with those in consideration, I personally have a bias for that grip, but you just use whatever works best for you. I will say that if you're trying to push the Zercher deadlift for the sake of strength in the Zercher deadlift, then I would prefer a hands together grip because that extra point of stability can increase your potential force production and theoretically help you lift more weight. Now, the argument could be made that just lifting more weight in general is going to create more stimulus so that it should always be used, but if you're not more comfortable with it, then it's not really a big deal. Also, like I said earlier, the hands apart grip may have some other benefits for sports and specificity and carry over to them that the hands together grip doesn't quite have. So there are pros and cons to both grips. Again, just choose what's comfortable for you at the beginning and can get you doing the Zercher deadlift. And then you can experiment with grips after you kind of have it down a bit. And for arm width, it's really easy. Just don't really think about it too much. Pull your shoulders forward, grab the bar, and then go with whatever is most comfortable and where the bar sits. If you do heavy holds, which I'm going to touch on later, it's going to kind of put your hands in that perfect position for you. So you don't really have to think about it. You just kind of do it. Okay, moving on to hip height. Just like with any deadlift, there's always a low hip height or a high hip height and then everything in between. So you really kind of just have to pick what is comfortable for you. If you pick a low hip height, then your body's going to be a little bit more parallel to the ground. You may have a little bit more quad drive with the movement, but you might also run into the issue of hitting your knees or sliding up your shins when you're trying to get off the ground. I've tried a very low hip height, but just due to my leverages, I can't get it past my knees because I just slam into them. So I tend to use a higher hip height. But the higher hip height might be too much in terms of hamstring mobility for some people, but that is also something you can work on and easily overcome with a bit of time. And again, you kind of just have to play around with it and see what's most comfortable for you. That's just kind of the common theme of all of this is try something. If it doesn't work, then just modify it slightly. Just kind of give out all the options here so that you can already go in with the knowledge of them all instead of having to guess your way around the movement. Another factor that is closely related to hip height is how much you scoop with the movement. So some people prefer to do a big scoop with the movement, and then once they're past their knees, they're really kind of sliding their knees forward, sliding their hips in, getting their body upright, and then standing up the rest of the way of the Zercher deadlift like it's a Zercher squat. This is fairly common to use, but it it does kind of break it up into two movements. So you have to kind of keep that in consideration, and it's closely related to hip height, because if you start with a lower hip and you're using a little bit more knee bend and knee drive off the beginning, you have a little bit less scoop to do to get into that Zercher squat position and then finish the lift. Whereas if you have a higher hip position like myself, then you have to do a much bigger scoop to transition into making it more of that Zercher squat to finish off the lift. I started off by having a scoop with my Zercher deadlift, but I found that I was just losing too much momentum when I would hit that transition point, and my lifts were dying. Especially if I was a little bit fatigued, it would just be like hitting a wall, and it was kind of frustrating. And like I said earlier, that's because I have that higher hip height to begin with, so I really needed to swing them down and under just to get into that Zercher squat position. Because I was losing that momentum there and it was just completely killing the lift, I decided to make it just more of a hinge all the way throughout and start with that higher hip, don't scoop under, and just finish it kind of like an RDL. And also, before I made this transition, I found that when I was doing my Zercher RDLs, they were pretty close to my Zercher deadlift. So I just thought, hey, if this is where I'm strong, I may as well make my Zercher deadlift favor that position, and it worked really well. And just a little tidbit of information, the imagery that I use on it is I just think I'm like a trebuchet and I'm about to throw and just horsecock this massive weight off the ground and just pivot around my hips. It honestly works amazing. I just hook under, and then from there, I'm just ripping it. Again, neither of these are really better or worse. It just depends where you're strong. And my story is just kind of an example of how I started with one, but then I experimented with the other because I found that I was losing a lot of momentum and a lot of strength in one position. So then I just switched it around. Feel free to just start with one, stick with it, get the movement down, and then start experimenting when you notice, hey, I'm not really strong with this movement doing it this way, but in these other movements, you may be stronger with a more kind of squatting position. So maybe you prefer that bigger swing under and finishing with a Zercher squat. It's no problem to just start one way and then gradually change over time. Don't be too kind of strict with one form and stick with it forever. Feel free to experiment. And moving on, a common question that I get with the Zercher deadlift is, how do you bail out of it? Well, it's really simple. And if you've ever done any front squats and had to bail out of them, then you're kind of going to have this movement down. But all you do is straighten your legs out a little bit, bend your body forward a bit more, and open up your arms. So you're doing that so that your knees kind of get back behind the bar, and then you can dump the bar forward. I also recommend doing a little bit of a scoot back on this. So practice it a few times with some lighter weight if you're not sure about it, and it'll probably come pretty naturally. And I'm going to say, don't try to just control the weight and bring it back down and then drop it all nicely. You're going to get stuck at the bottom of the Zercher squat, which is awful because the bar ends up being behind your knees. So you can't really bend forward and actually dump it in front of you. Your main option there is to just kind of fall back with the bar. If you're a little bit thicker, then the bar is going to crush you and you're going to get stuck under it. It's also just not fun to fall back with a bar on any lift. Don't worry about dropping the bar and being loud. Great, so now you know pretty much everything about how to do the Zercher deadlift, but what do you do about your terrible mobility that doesn't allow you to grab the bar from the ground? And what about that pain in your elbows every time you grab it? Well, to build up the mobility, it's really simple. Just do more Zercher deadlifts. That's a great tip, eh? I'm serious though. Doing the movement to the best of your capability is going to increase your mobility for that movement. The only difference I recommend is, instead of trying to beat your head through the wall and do them from the ground because you can't, is to do them off the rack. So this is really easy. You just unrack the bar, take a few steps back, get into your stance width, and then do the Zercher deadlift down as far as you can and come back up. For this, I recommend starting with lighter weight that you can easily control so you can really push that range. You don't want to be getting close to your end range of motion and then kind of backing away from it and fearing it because you're going to be too weak to get out of it. You want a weight that you can kind of stretch into that position with, because the goal of this is to get you Zercher deadlifting from the ground. And you might notice that at the start of the set, you're barely getting past your knees, but by the end, you're almost reaching the floor. And that shows that you are using an appropriate weight and doing it right. So you want to see a slight improvement, at least, of mobility throughout the set. And then from week to week, you're going to find that your mobility is slowly improving. Mobility changes also take time, so be patient with it and don't worry about rushing it. Just kind of take what you can. And it's really good to also pair these rack Zercher deadlifts with some block Zercher deadlifts. So find a block height that is just within your comfort zone, almost pushing it, but then you can still get into that position and produce the force from there. These are really helpful because that bottom position before you start producing force can be really uncomfortable and really holds a lot of people back, because they don't understand how to go from no force production there to force production there. So this is going to teach you to be able to produce force in those deeper ranges of motion from nothing, and is really helpful as you're building up that mobility, and will really speed up the process. And again, closely related to this is to do some Zercher RDLs. So you're going to take a closer stance like your normal RDL stance, but then hold the bar in your elbows and bend forward. This is really going to strengthen up your back, increase the mobility of your back, as well as really increase the mobility of your hamstrings. And another benefit is that it can get you comfortable with that bottom position where your head kind of needs to be facing the ground or even facing your own shins, and your hands are going to be getting all up in your own face. This really throws a lot of people off at the beginning, but it's just a reality of the movement. So you have to be comfortable with basically touching your own nose as you're trying to get the bar off the ground. And these Zercher RDLs are great for it. Other things that you can do to kind of help speed up this process for the mobility is just train the muscles and joints that are involved in the movement through their full range of motion. So you're going to want to train your adductors through their full range of motion, as well as your hamstrings. So you can do some direct kind of work on these. You can do the seated adductor machine. I like using a cable machine where I hook my foot up and then it just pulls my leg out to the side. And then same with hamstrings. You can do some seated hamstring curls. Lean forward and really extend your knee as much as you can so you can get that great hamstring stretch. Or like myself, I don't have access to that, so I use a cable machine and I've set it up so that I can get a great hamstring stimulus on that while pushing their range of motion. And for the back, doing Jefferson curls along with the Zercher RDLs is great. Sometimes the Zercher RDLs can hold you back because you're still getting used to that Zercher grip. So the Jefferson curl is a little bit more normal because you have that bar in your hands, and it allows you to push that back mobility and back strength as you're building up to the Zercher deadlift. And for all of these exercises and any new exercise in general, you're going to want to start off with low weight, low volume, and kind of lower frequency so that you're giving your body enough time to recover between sets, between reps, and between sessions. Anytime you're introducing something new, that can be a very new stimulus on not only your muscles, joints, tendons, ligaments, etc., but also your brain. So you have to kind of get used to the movement and build up the coordination with it. You're going to want to have enough rest time between so that you can fully recover and go into the next session doing well. And you don't want it to mess up your other lifts as well. Far too often I see people try to build up the mobility for these movements and they just go and start doing 10 sets of a bunch of reps of all these exercises, and then they wonder why they're in pain the next week. It's because you're training like an idiot. Like, no duh. You need to use some load management and allow your body time to recover. You can't force this adaptation by just doing more than you're capable of. That's going to slow you down. So work with your body, be patient, and fall in love with the process. Okay, so how do you toughen up your elbows? Well, again, it's pretty simple. Just do more Zerchers. Switch up your accessories to have the Zercher grip. So do some Zercher lunges, Zercher RDLs, Zercher good mornings, etc. The more time you spend with the bar in your elbows, the more comfortable you're going to get with it and the less it's going to hurt. It's just like the first time you got into squatting. The bar on your back and your traps probably was pretty uncomfortable and probably left you with bruises the next day. But after a few weeks and doing a couple sessions a week at least, it probably didn't feel all that bad and you were starting to get used to it. And now you're at the point where you go to squat and you don't even really notice the bar on your back at all. It's the exact same with Zerchers and your elbows. You just kind of have to give them time to get used to the movement and actually expose them to it. The first few times are going to suck. And now that you're stronger than the first time you tried squatting, you're probably going to try weight that is going to cause more discomfort. So bring the weight down and then just be patient again. And one tool that you can use if you're trying to build all of this up, but your elbows are really holding you back, is you can put sleeves on your arms. However, with this, I do find that it kind of opens up the elbow joint a little bit more and pushes the bar away. So it actually makes the Zerchers a little bit harder. That's why I prefer to not use elbow sleeves, but sometimes if you have to film 100 Zerchers and then do a full workout after and treat patients, your arms get kind of bruised up. So they can be helpful in certain situations. And one thing to really speed up the process of that elbow toughening is to do heavy Zercher holds. So at the beginning, you're going to want to start light with a weight that's comfortable, but your elbows will adapt to the pain faster than your strength kind of adapts to the Zercher position. So you can kind of speed up that elbow process by doing these heavy holds. Start off light, but within a few weeks, you can easily ramp them up to heavier weight. It's not uncommon to go from about 50% of your body weight to double body weight in a few weeks or a month. And once your elbows are a little bit more comfortable with these and you're actually kind of pushing weight, you'll notice that they start to strengthen your upper back a little bit more, which can help with the Zercher deadlifts altogether. And if you decide to use these as an accessory like I myself do, then try to find a weight that you can hold for about 5 to 20 seconds. Anything longer than that, and it's kind of just getting too long for effective dosage. I will say that when you're setting these up, make sure you have the safeties up as well as the rack height being high enough so you only have to lift the bar a couple inches to get it off, and then don't step out of the rack, just hold it above the pins. You don't need to step back, and you want the safeties up because if you do stumble, you don't want the bar crashing down on you. You want the rack to be able to catch it. Since you aren't walking back, the chances of stumbling are pretty low, but if you're pushing that weight, it's better to be safe than sorry. Okay, so now you know how to do them. You have some tricks on how to work up the mobility for them, but how do you program them? Well, how do you program any lift? If you answer that, then you answer the question to this. If they're a main lift, then program them that way. One example I like to use is, how do you program your regular deadlift? Well, just swap out regular deadlifts with Zercher deadlifts, and then you'll program them that way. Or if you want to use them as a supplementary exercise to build up some horse meat on you, then you can lower the weight a little bit and do 5+ reps to really kind of hit that hypertrophy with them. Or if you're using them mainly as a mobility exercise, then lower the weight, find some ways that you can push that range even more. Pause at the bottom to really kind of feel that stretch and do them that way. Programming all exercises is really easy, and it doesn't really depend what the exercise is. It depends what your goal is. All exercise is made up, so just make it fit what you want to get out of it. I have a really good video going over this, so I'll link that in the description. All right, I think that's a pretty complete guide on Zercher deadlifts. I took some of the feedback I got from my first video on this topic, and I think I applied it pretty well. But if there's still some questions that you have, then leave them down in the comments and I might answer them there or make some videos on the topics in the future. As always, thank you very much for watching. Now go out there and make some gains.